Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Underwater Photography Show. We've been away for a little bit, but as always, I'm Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm Alex Mustard.
And I'll preface this, I'm a little bit under the weather, so if I sound all nasally or cold or sniffly, that is why. But we're going to do a techie one today. We have some non-techie ones coming up, but today's a techie one. We're going to do a deep dive into strobes and the specs and the batteries and all that kind of stuff to clear up a little bit of the confusion around all of the numbers that are thrown around with regards to strobes. So, Alex, I know you would like to take this one away. So,
Yeah, and I think kind of one of the first messages is to remember I think every underwater photographer would say that light is really important in photography. There's a lot more to light and therefore a lot more to strobes than simply the numbers. And I think one of the reasons that we wanted to record this episode was just to do a little bit of myth busting on some of those numbers that underwater photographers cling on to, because everyone knows 14 is bigger than 12, 12 is bigger than 10. But actually, what those numbers really mean and which are the ones you should be paying attention to, which you should be taking with a small pinch of salt, and which you should be taking with a massive handful of salt, because it's really not telling you anything very useful, despite the fact there'll be a million experts online telling you that what they've bought is better because it's got a bigger number than the one you bought. So with that in mind, I was going to start off with, I think perhaps the least useful guidance of any of the numbers, and that's guide number. And this is not a problem really of guide number in itself. It's the fact that it's basically very misleading in terms of underwater photography because of the way strobes work. And a guide number of a flash gun is officially the amount of power in exposure terms. So the number is actually the f-stop that you need to close down to get the correct exposure when that flash gun is fired a meter away from the subject at ISO 100. Now, I've seen in underwater photography, just before we even get into the details of guide number, I've seen guide numbers quoted at 1 foot. I've seen them quoted for 3 foot. I've seen them quoted for ISO 200. So guide numbers, people can just change those basic parameters. And it's very rarely that you will see a guide number quoted with it specifying underneath, this is at 1 meter, this is at ISO 100. So, people already cheat the system like that. And I think if you've ever sort of, spent any time watching the world of underwater photography, you'll know that manufacturers will always massage the figures in their direction. Anyway, the reason I have an issue with guide number is not to do with failures in the measurements of it, is the fact that all it tells you about a strobe is how much power you get at a certain distance. And the way that you can increase the amount of power that you get from a strobe at a certain distance is to change the angle of the beam. And the tighter you make that beam, the brighter it gets. It's pretty obvious stuff. The problem is that a tight beam strobe is probably the least attractive type of strobe for underwater photography. So if a manufacturer wants their strobe to have a high guide number to try and persuade photographers to buy it, they'll simply just make it narrower and narrower beamed, and that will boost the guide number up. If you've ever bought a land flash for your camera, a lot of them have zoom heads, and they'll actually quote guide numbers for the two ends of the zoom. And when they're zoomed right in, they have very high guide numbers, and when they're zoomed out, they're much lower guide numbers. And just within one strobe, you can see that variation. I've always sort of, when I talk about this on workshops and things, I always talk about it. It's like putting jam on a piece of bread. Guide number tells you how thick the jam is, but it doesn't tell you how much it's been spread out. So a strobe that puts a big dollop of jam right in the middle of the piece of bread, that's got a really high guide number. That must be good. Whereas another strobe that maybe puts more jam on but spreads it much, much wider might end up with a slightly lower guide number. So guide number is how thick the jam is, but it does not tell you anything about how big the piece of bread is or whether the jam has been spread to the corners of the piece of bread. So for that reason, it can be very misleading in underwater photography. So please do not only use the guide number as a measurement. A measurement of power is a bit more reliable than guide number, but is not perfect either, is the energy output of the flash gun, which is quoted in watt seconds. and that's a sort of an energy measurement of the output of a strobe. The problem with watt seconds for us is that as individuals, we can't measure that. We have to take the manufacturer's word on on the power output as gospel. And obviously, if people are already fudging the figures on guide number because we can independently verify guide number, we should be able to measure it. Something that we can't independently measure, you think they might fudge the numbers a little bit more. Another factor in why watt seconds is not brilliantly reliable is that strobes definitely have a different relationship between the light output of a flash tube and the energy going in. Some flash tubes are more efficient than others. So for me, I would say that watt seconds is, I know the analogy I use for that when I'm teaching is, it's like the speedometer in a car. Some cars' speedometers go really, really high and some don't. Yes, the faster cars probably have higher reading speedometers, but it doesn't tell you everything about the performance of a car. So watt seconds, I think, is a more reliable measure than guide number, but be aware that there's no way to check it, so it might not be true. And secondly, the efficiency of the flash tube also plays a role because you can actually get more light out of a lower watt second flash gun. But obviously, if something's got half the watt seconds of another strobe and they're both pretty reliable numbers, then you can imagine that the higher one is going to be much more powerful. So that's kind of the bit on power I wanted to do. I thought we should next dive into beam angle, and maybe you want to jump in on beam angle, Matt.
Yeah, so the beam angle kind of is another one that I think has, like, the numbers can be a bit squirrely, because
there isn't a recognized way of measuring it, is it?
Exactly. Yeah. It's just kind of, it looks super wide. Let's call it whatever number of degrees, and that's good. Because again, it's hard to measure it really, and you can shoot it against a wall, similar to how people test for guide number and all that kind of stuff. But again, it'll depend on your distance to how far you are from the wall, whether you're using diffusers, all that kind of stuff.
And very much where you draw that circle, because the flash guns don't typically suddenly stop. They fade away, and it's usually people go, well, it's when the light is 10% of the central brightness, that's the edge of the beam. But others might measure it to where it's 0%, and others might measure it to where it's only dropped to 25%. So it's. And
there are for sure strobes that have a harsher fall off than others. And at least for me, especially if you're shooting wide angle, the softer the fall off and the more consistent the light all the way across whatever your subject is going to be a more pleasing, or at least for me would be a better strobe because it has more pleasing light.
It avoids hot spots and shadows, doesn't it?
Yeah. But it's difficult to measure. And a lot of those strobes with high guide numbers have much more focused beams. So you get a much more narrow angle of view on your strobe. And certain things like that are much easier to see and quantify than exactly how wide the beam goes. But you'll see a lot of the manufacturers have their beam spread out to 160 degrees. And if that were true, you'd probably only need one strobe really, and you'd have perfect angles of coverage for your light. And that rarely does that seem to be the case. So what I would do with that is I would look at images shot with those particular strobes that you're interested in and see if you like how it's lighting up the frame. Because you can definitely see different qualities of light in a scene that somebody has photographed. And obviously there's differences there because of post-processing and things like that. But I wouldn't necessarily just go off whatever a manufacturer says their spec'd beam angle is, because it doesn't always seem to be the case. And sometimes they might actually underestimate how wide the beam is, which also isn't helpful, but can be a nice surprise if you think it's much narrower than it ends up being.
Yeah, and beam angle is very much linked with what we talk about in terms of quality of light. I think the things I would say is that when you have a very nice soft wide beam with the strobe, it also makes the strobe. It doesn't just make your pictures look nicer; it makes shooting them easier, because those types of strobes are much more forgiving on those small changes in strobe position in terms of lighting. So you don't only produce a nicer quality of light, it's easier to reach that nicer quality of light, which I think is an important factor. That said, if you are an out-and-out macro photographer who does 1 or 2 wide-angle dives a year, or you mainly do wide-angle in very turbid, low visibility conditions where you don't want to light the world up, those are situations where a narrower beam strobe might actually be something you specifically are looking for, because you're not trying to light up a whole scene evenly. You're generally more lighting up individual elements within it in a wide angle scene, or you do wide angle so infrequently that actually a more macro focused strobe is more the way you want to go in terms of quality of light. But when most underwater photographers talk quality of light, we're talking nice wide soft beams. Generally the wider the better. And it's more about that fall off of light. And I think this is, what I would say, there's no standardized measurement. But I think when you look at pictures, you see it, particularly in how well the light goes from the center of the frame out towards the edges. If those edges are running into darkness, or relatively so to the middle, that's usually a harsher quality of light. Whereas when the light seems to nice and evenly light up the whole scene right to the edges, that's that more pleasing quality of light. The advice I've always given to people is look online at underwater photos when there's photographers' work who you think is really, really pleasing and you really like that look of pictures. Assuming they're not sponsored and you can believe what they tell you, I'd investigate, ask what strobes they're using underneath their posts, and that'll give you a good guide to strobes that are producing the quality of light that you want. Okay, our next one is recycle time. Which kind of links also into batteries these days. So maybe we can tackle the two together. So, cool. Matt, what's your view on recycle time? Easy to measure, at least.
So to be honest, if I'm shooting with flash, I almost never am shooting high speeds with whatever camera I'm using. I usually shoot a single frame at a time. Maybe I'll do 2 or 3 frames at a time if I'm shooting something specific. So I've never been overly concerned with recycle time. That said, if you have faster recycle times with a flash, it can be beneficial for certain situations. If you have something really fast, let me start over. If you have some fast action happening that you want to capture, it can be useful to be able to bump up to 5 or 6 or 7 frames a second and still have the flash keep up. But I don't. For me personally, it is not something that I take into consideration all that much with regards to underwater flashes. It's at the very bottom of the list of things that are important to me. So it's not like you said, with regards to batteries, if you have those big battery packs, generally you get faster recycle times. And it just is coincidental that I prefer to use the big battery packs, but that's just so I can have long days of shooting and not worried about changing batteries now and then. But I don't particularly care, to put it bluntly, about the recycle times of flashes. And I couldn't honestly tell you, of the 3 or 4 strobe models I have here, I couldn't tell you the recycle times on any of them because I've never actually looked.
I think that's a very true take on it. Is the reality is most underwater photographers, we take a picture, we want to review that picture before taking more pictures. Yeah. It's not typical in underwater photography that there's 3 or 4 amazingly unique underwater photos available every second. Pictures, are either available for longer than that, or it's the same picture again and again, and you really didn't need to shoot them that fast. I think the reason we see recycle time quoted a lot is it's another number that's easy for people to share and think and talk about. I'd also just point out that, again, there's no really nailed on specified way of measuring recycle time, and most strobe manufacturers will talk about when the strobe will fire again after you taking one picture. It's not necessarily the time it takes for the capacitors to be fully charged, so you'll often have a strobe that will fire, but the second and third shots will be less bright than the first shot, but that's still within their recycle time. So even though there's an easy number, again, there's a way for manufacturers to wiggle around measuring it in a non-consistent way, because they often measure it as to when the strobe will actually put some light out again, even if it's not back to the same level that you just emptied it from. The other factor I would say in this that's really important is that we're now starting to see coming on the market strobes with lithium batteries in. And one of the things that the power of lithium batteries do is they do reduce that recycle time. So we're seeing recycle time being pushed as a must-have feature in underwater photography to encourage us all to buy new flash guns. So think very carefully if you're buying a flash gun with that as a need. My feeling is, if you're a land photographer and you shoot birds with fast-moving wings, or you shoot, animals that blink, you need those high frame rates at times to capture those magic moments. I don't think we have that. The water's viscous, things don't move quickly like that underwater. There aren't so many of those opportunities that are critical underwater. Now everyone's like, oh, what about bait balls? And I had a sea lion going through a bait ball, it was going really fast. Yes, maybe that is a situation where you want a high frame rate. Are you necessarily going to be able to keep up with that bait ball pushing strobes through the water? Probably not. So, there may be some times when high frame rates can be useful, but I wouldn't put it up there as a particularly important measure.
Yeah, I would say frame rate without flash would be more important than frame rate with flash, because those times when something's happening really quickly, it's usually something pelagic that you're going to have to be trying to keep up with. And with, it's hard enough when you're just carrying a camera housing, much less if you have strobes and all that kind of jazz attached to it. So that's when I would care more about frame rate, and in that case, strobes don't matter anyway. So not necessarily a consideration.
Yeah. I'd like to dive into the batteries though. Yeah. And I think one thing I would say is that the lithium batteries at the top, in the middle, sort of custom battery packs, and at the bottom, kind of AA batteries, the higher ones on those definitely give you more faster recycle time and sometimes a bit more power from flash guns, but it's more the recycle time being reduced that the lithium batteries do. The downside of that list is the higher up that list you go, the more specialist the batteries are. And I think, one thing I would say is if you are a traveling photographer, if you have a specialist battery pack on your strobe and it goes wrong, it floods, the catch that attach it breaks, all these things can happen. If no one else on your trip has that battery, that strobe's out of action for the trip. If you are running a strobe with AA's, you have that redundancy. Any shop anywhere in the world, pretty much, you're going to be able to buy a set of AA batteries. If you're on a trip with other underwater photographers, there's going to be spare AA batteries around, and that's a big attraction to those strobes. For those strobes that take those batteries. One thing though, I would say that I got from shooting the lithium batteries in both in the strobes I was using this summer. We were not going to mention brands at all in this one, so I'm just paddling back a bit there. Is I found with the lithium batteries, because they've got this really big capacity and that you can shoot fast, you can shoot lots of frames without recharging, I felt freer to use the full power settings more of the time than I do perhaps with my own batteries. And the only analogy I can sort of pull off for that one is it's a bit like when you're driving an electric car. If your journey is like under half of, under half your range left in the battery, say, you've got 100 miles of range left and you've only got to go 20 miles to somewhere, you tend to drive the car really fast in that situation. If you're doing an 80-mile drive and you've got 100 mile of range, it tends to impact how you are all drive. And that's what I'd say you get from the lithium batteries in the strobes, is that they give you the confidence to use more of the performance more of the time. Yeah. And it's purely psychological, but I definitely find that it does encourage you to make the most of them.
Well, so for example, if I do like a day at the springs here, which I can be in the water for 5 or 6 hours, 99 times out of 100, I end up taking the strobes that have the big battery packs. Just because, like you said, it's probably psychological. I'd be fine using the AA's, but something about having the big battery pack gives you like a little more peace of mind that you're like, all right, I'm good. It's one less thing that I need to worry about, whether it's justified or not. It's one less thing to worry about over the course of the day, that you've got, essentially endless battery life. Especially if you're not shooting at full power, those lithium packs will last days. Well, at least the way I shoot. I won't comment for how you shoot, but at least for me, those lithium packs will last days and days. Because A, I rarely shoot at full power, and B, I don't take a whole lot of pictures. So,
right, I'm going to truck you a dodgy one now. TTL as a feature of a strobe.
Don't care about it. Never used it. Never will use it. I none of the strobes that I shoot, well, that's not true. One of them has TTL. I've never used it. The other ones don't have TTL. I can see for macro shooters just getting started where it could be useful. But I would always tell people to learn how to shoot the strobes manually. You'll have far more control over what your pictures look like. And TTL isn't infallible even with regards to macro. And especially for wide angle, it's not something I would ever rely on. So I guess it has its place in certain situations, but for anyone, not to sound insulting, but for anyone who's serious about shooting pictures underwater, learn how to shoot your strobes manually and forget about TTL.
It's a much better use of your money, isn't it? I agree with you on that, and I'm not going to dive in on that. If it's an important feature for you, it's an important feature for you. In this guide. But I think the other thing I would just say about TTL is it's not that it's this perfect black box as well. That some strobes definitely have better TTL performance than others, and they all tick the TTL box. So again, on that specification sheet, just be aware. Try and find some real world people who say, "Yeah, I use that." If TTL is important to you, check in with some other users and go, do you use the strobe on TTL a lot? Does it really work over a wide range of settings, or does it actually just only work when you've nearly got it right anyway with manual? And next on my list is size and weight. And I think we'd all like the strobes to be as small as possible and as light as possible, within reason. I think in my book I said, I wish more strobes were shaped like cake tins rather than beer cans. Because we want as big a light source as possible. But obviously, actually, when they're cake tins, they're quite hard to aim, actually. So a bit of length helps you aim the strobe. But ultimately, a small strobe is not just more friendly for travel and for carrying your camera rig around. It does help you with strobe positionings, particularly for very close focus work and for macro work. And I think small strobes allow you to double up for both wide angle and macro with them. I think some of the really big wide angle strobes, they are a bit cumbersome for macro. They get in the way, they bash into subjects, they limit strobe positions. And I think if you do have big wide angle strobes, you often end up buying some smaller strobes for macro. Weight, out of the water, the heavier your strobes are, plus batteries, plus chargers. Don't just go on the weight of the strobes, because one brand I was using recently, they were quite heavy strobes, but actually the only accessory you needed to take with them was a USB-C cable, because the charger was built into the battery pack. So, although the strobe was quite heavy, there were no accessories needed in terms of charging. And that made a big difference in weight. Weight in the water as well. If strobes are really heavy, it can make the rig quite a pain to use. Particularly, I think, with macro shooting, if you're in mid-water, you're trying to be neutral and shooting with that. So look to see how heavy the strobes are. Look to see if the manufacturer is offering buoyancy and things like that to make them neutral. It can really improve your enjoyment from them. We'd all like our strobes to be neutral in the water, weigh nothing at check-in, and be nice and big when we need them to be, to move them around, but nice and small when we need them to be. But so those are your wish lists. Every strobe is a compromise on that list. Some find a better compromise than others.
I like you said, for big wide angle stuff, for pelagic stuff, if I'll take the big strobes, because you have plenty of endless space essentially. And if you can have big power and easy maneuverability, it's always a good thing. But if you're doing something that's tighter in or macro or close quarters, fortunately I have strobes that are smaller than that are more easily maneuverable.
And obviously the majority of people can't necessarily afford to get two sets of strobes as well, or don't dive enough to be able to justify it. It's probably a better way of saying it. Okay, synchronization type. The two main synchronization types for strobes are fiber optic cables for an optical signal and electronic cables for an electrical system. Most strobes historically offered both. Some only offered one. These days, more and more people are going over to fibers, so there are more strobes now only offering fiber. It's important, I'd also mention, we said trying to keep manufacturers' names out of this, but one of the manufacturers now offers a cable-free system. I have no experience as to whether that's reliable, whether it makes your friend's strobes fire and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, if that's, really important to you to not have a cable connecting your strobe to your camera, you might want to look at it at that particular route. But yeah, it's just, again, think about what you need, think about what you like. I don't see it a problem if you always like electronic sync and you're happy with electronic sync, then fine. If you always use fiber and you're happy with fiber, fine. You don't need to buy a strobe with both if you know what you like. But it's important to check that the strobe does support what you want.
I have strobes that take both, and I have an old housing here that still only has an electronic bulkhead. I have no problem shooting either one, and both have their pros and cons. So again, it just kind of comes down to what you're comfortable shooting with, or whatever. Now, like you said, a lot of strobes are only offering fiber optic. So if the strobe you want only has that, well, then that problem is taken care of for you. You don't really need to worry about it. So.
Okay, and then the final things on my list are other specs like high-speed sync, like some of the smart slave modes. I know some of the strobes you can use one strobe to control another, and other features like some of the what's the other one I'm thinking of? There's some I know one manufacturer has a low power mode which can be quite useful for when you're doing open aperture macro, things like that. Those I would say are, for me, they're nice additions. I don't think many people are buying strobes and using those other modes as a main way of shooting. They're nice things, particularly if you maybe do a lot of diving in the same place, and it's a great way for the strobe to provide you with some fun ideas to try different ways of shooting. I would say all of those, including HSS, which does have a decent role to play in underwater photography, I don't consider it as an essential thing. There are certain shots that it enables you to do, but for kind of most normal shooting, I'm not normally using any of those features. But when I want to do something different, it's cool to be able to have that extra capability. But again, you need to cost in the fact that with some of those features, you need to buy maybe a different flash trigger, which can add quite a lot of expense to the system. And I think it's important to think through how much you might need those usage. Maybe speak to some other photographers. Oh, you've got a strobe that has that feature. Do you use it a lot, or did you use it once on one dive and have never used it again? To understand whether you should be spending money that way. And the final hot potato I'm going to throw your way, Matt, is our last category here, and that's the accessories, particularly the ones that go, on the front of the strobes to modify the light. What are your thoughts on accessories and how important those are?
So I usually have multiple strobe accessories on every dive that I do, unless I'm doing something specific like pelagics. So for me, fortunately, I have a friend who's good at making custom done accessories and things like that, so I don't have to worry about specifics too much. But if you, like you said, if you do a lot of macro or you do a lot of creative lighting or things like that, the strobes that have accessories like snoots or reduction rings or colored filters or any of that stuff, not all of them offer those things. That can be a deciding factor in whatever you end up choosing to go with. And most manufacturers at least have snoots now, but again, quality of snoot makes a big difference as well. So I don't actually shoot like snoots. I have reduction rings and diffusers and things like that. So I don't have to choose between strobes based on that anymore, thankfully. But there are certain companies who make a lot of accessories, and we probably know who they are. And a lot of those accessories are really useful. But whether or not they'll be useful to your shooting is something you have to decide for yourself, and don't necessarily go with a manufacturer just because they have the most accessories. If the strobe that they have is not necessarily the one that you want, I don't necessarily think that should be a deciding factor, unless you're hardcore into macro or things like that. Then that might make a difference.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. Is do the research ahead of time. You do not have to buy all the accessories when you buy the strobe.
Yeah.
Speak to other users, and actually it can be quite a nice way of, on one trip adding a new accessory. It gives you a whole new capability. You can have really good fun playing with that idea, getting new types of shots with it, and then introducing another accessory on another trip can be a good thing. I would also, bear in mind what Matt said, if you've got friends or there's people in the community who are making lighting accessories, I have a friend, a very good photographer who the strobe he uses doesn't have any reduction rings. He really likes the strobe. It's small, it's powerful, it's good for macro. He got a guy to make him some reduction rings from it, and he now adores that strobe because it's got exactly the quality of light he wants. It was a $20-$30 job to make this really nice reduction ring for each of these strobes, and it's transformed their capability. But the manufacturer doesn't make those available. So, make sure there's an easy way to mount stuff on there. Do some research to check that people are making accessories that fit them. And you don't necessarily need to choose the manufacturer who makes them, because you can get these aftermarket ones.
Yeah, and even if you don't have a friend, there's a million places with 3D printers where you can walk in and be like, hi, this is what I'd like to have done. And just kind of give them the specs, and they can probably do it for you for, like Alex said, $20-$30. Mm-hmm. One other thing I don't think we covered is, like, a lot of strobes do have video lights or focus lights now. For me, I don't care about the video light side. I have found situations where having the focus light built in is pretty useful, either if my focus light dies, or what happens more frequently, I forget one. So that can also be a useful thing to think about.
It's a good safety thing as well to have an extra light source.
Yes. Yeah. So another thing that most of them have at least a focus light now, different varying strengths, but just something else to keep in mind if that is going to be important to you. Or if you are a shooter who does video and stills, buying a strobe that has a video light might be the way to go as well, instead of having to invest in multiple expensive lighting options.
Yeah, and if you're a snooterholic, then a central focus light can make a really big difference. There's a road near me actually called Snoot Lane. I keep meaning to take a photo of the signpost. I must do it next time I go past Snoot Lane. I don't know what it's certainly not named after a strobe snoot. I don't know what it's named after. The one thing we were going to talk about in beam angle and quality of light is the difference between straight and circular flash tubes. The general view on that from the underwater photography community is that circular flash tubes give a wider, softer beam naturally than straight flash tubes. Straight flash tubes give a strong, more directional beam. A lot is also in the reflectors behind them. And, all I would say is, yes, that's a good generalization, but don't keep it as simple as that when you're doing your investigation. Really look at the quality of light in people's pictures to really understand what you want and what those strobes can give you. Don't just assume that every strobe with a circular flash tube is going to give a nicer quality of light than every strobe with a straight flash tube. Although, in all fairness, that's not too far off the mark, but there are exceptions, and a really well set up strobe with straight flash tubes can give really nice quality of light. Yeah,
like you said, not all round flash tubes are created equal. There's a very well-known strobe that's not made anymore that had a round flash tube, and it was powerful, but it had a pretty narrow beam, and didn't have the spread that a lot of the round tube flashes now have. So just, again, take a look at some pictures from different strobes, see the kind of light you like, and decide on it from that.
Well done, everyone, for making it through this monster episode. I think it's definitely maybe it's our longest episode without a guest on. But I hope it's really helpful. I think our closing remarks are that there's a lot more to choosing the right strobe than specifications. Understanding the nuances of those specifications and when they are reliable and when they're not reliable, I think can really help guide that choice. And ultimately, photography is about images. Look at pictures you like, understand what gear they're taken with. Ideally, look at pictures without too much processing on them, because you can take a really crummy picture these days and make it look amazing. And then you can convince everyone to buy that product because it's been, and also make sure you're getting honest opinions from other members of the community rather than people whose opinions on certain products are biased by a paycheck arriving in their bank account every month. Other than that, thanks for watching another episode of the Underwater Photography Show. We'll be back again soon.